Welcome back everybody for another video, another DevX tutorial. And today's subject is going to be looking at querying your views and filtering those both with normal filters like regular fields that you'd have in your workbook, but also taking a look at parameters, specifically date parameters. And the thing that's inspiring this video is that somebody had this kind of tricky situation that they contacted me about, and it had to do with trying to download data for their view or download a PDF of their view, much like what you would see here. And whenever they were inputting a date for this parameter that they have, in our case we're going to call this date cutoff, just wasn't registering. So it wasn't having any effect, and we'll go through in this video why and how, if you need to do something like this, you can make it happen. All right, so let's dive into some code, and let's just jump right into it. So we're going to be, first of all, importing URL-lib. The reason we're doing this is that we kind of have a lot of control when we're using this library, tableau-api-lib. We have a lot of control over which parameters we're going to pass when we are filtering our views. And by the way, if you have no idea that you could filter views when you download a PDF or your view data, look no further than the Tableau REST API reference. So out here we have this nice way of being able to easily filter. When we make the request to get our view, we can just do this pattern where we say, well, the question mark's always here for extra URL parameters, but then after this you do a VF underscore, that would always be there. And then you have whatever the name is of your parameter or of your field. You can do both, parameters and fields. And then you say, I want that to equal whatever the value is that you're filtering on. Now there's a little nuance here in that you are passing a URL parameter, so you can't just be inputting any kind of special characters in there. And if I'm speaking a different language right now, special characters would be things like spaces or things that aren't URL friendly. So you could go out and Google, what characters can I put into a URL? Or you could just trust me on this and import this library, URL-lib. And what we're going to be using from there is a little function that's going to allow us to scrub our parameter names and our filter names and the values clean, such that they could be passed into a URL parameter or passed in as a URL parameter without causing any problems. If you don't do that and you have special characters in your names or in your values, like spaces or pipe characters, then you're going to have some problems, and the thing that you're trying to filter on just won't register. Okay, so we import that library. We also import, of course, tableau-api-lib because that's the library we're using to interact with our Tableau environment. And we are importing some querying functions, as we'll see below. These will be useful to get information about the view that we're actually trying to download PDFs of. And then we are also going to get this flattened dict column, which we'll see is useful when we want to maybe know which workbook we're hitting. So let's just get connected. Here we have some config that we define, and this is the gateway for me being able to talk to my Tableau environment. If this is new to you, then do check out the Getting Started video in the description of this one. And suffice to say, this is all the details we need to get hooked up to our Tableau environment. Right here, I've defined this config and named it DevX. So down here, when I actually establish a connection to Tableau, I'm going to say, this is the environment that I'm trying to connect to. I defined it up here. It's DevX. That's the one I'm connecting to. All right, so we do that. We sign in, and then we can see this response code 200 is good. That means that we're in. So now that we have that connection to our environment, let's start out by saying, okay, we want to download a PDF or data for a view. Well, which view is it? So we could take a look at all the views that are available to us in the environment by running this querying.getViewsDataFrame function. So this is at the end of the day, just making use of some of the functions you would find, or some of the endpoints you would find out here in the Tableau API reference. But rather than having to reinvent the wheel, we just use this function over here that's part of the library, and it gives us all these details about our views. Now, I'm not sure which workbook I want to grab my view from. In this case, I'm always making tutorials, so I have all these views that are named the same thing. Like out here, this crypto prices by time worksheet. This is popping up in lots of different workbooks because I've just recycled them. So if you're in the situation where all of your views might have the same name, or a lot of your views might have the same name, well, then you might want to narrow it down to a specific workbook. In this case, I had named this workbook, let's see, save as, name this test param queries. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to unpack some detail about my workbook, with the goal here being inside this workbook column, when we query our views, we can actually find out which workbook a view is associated with. But right now it's kind of tucked away inside this JSON body that we'll want to unpack some details from in order to get at those juicy details about what's the name of this workbook, what's the workbook ID, if we needed that kind of information. And all this little tangent that we're going off here, but I figure this is kind of in reality something that a lot of people need to do. So let's just see what this looks like. That column was named workbook. So I'm going to define a new version of my views data frame where I use that flatten dict column function that we imported way up here. This is part of the library. I'm just going to use this to flatten that workbook JSON that we had in there, or dict in the Python world. And I'm going to unpack from that a few of these keys that exist in there. So name and ID. And what I'll end up with at the end of the day here is a data frame that's giving me the workbook name and the name of that view that I had queried, and then the ID of the view that I queried. So when I get this information, that's just making it my life a little bit easier here, where I could say, okay, I had some views, which we can see down here. I have I guess I have 3 of them that have the same name, but they belong to different workbooks. This is the workbook that I care about. This is the one that I'm publishing and that I'm building this demo off of. So this is the one whose view I want to interact with in this tutorial. Now, if this process here is at all confusing to you, then let's have some more videos on this down the road. I think we could use as much practice with interacting with these views data frames, these workbooks data frames as possible. But for now, let's just push forward. We've got this ID here, and then we store that as the view ID we'll be interacting with moving forward. So now we get to this part where we're going to actually define our parameters. So remember out here, we have these URL parameters that can filter the view that we're downloading as a PDF or downloading as an image. So what does that actually look like in practice? Well, first of all, we need to just define our names. And every step of the way here, we're going to define a name. For example, this filter that I have out in my workbook, I am filtering to a specific cryptocurrency symbol. So I'm going to go ahead and set that as a filter as well. So we can see that this works for both filters and parameters, because this indeed is a filter. It's a filter that's based off of a field I have in the workbook, but then we're also filtering on a date, which is controlled by a parameter that I have in the workbook. By the way, how is that parameter even impacting things? Well, I just have it interacting with one of my fields, my date field, and this parameter is going to help decide if I put in a date cutoff, this expression here is going to evaluate to true or false for all of my data points out here. And so any date that falls after the date cutoff will basically be filtered out, because I'm filtering this to only allow in values that evaluate to true, that the date is less than or equal to my date cutoff. All right, nothing too fancy there, just standard filter and parameter interactions in the Tableau world. All right, so as we define all of these values, remember I said it's important that your URL, like the text that you put into a URL as a URL parameter, it should be clean, it should be URL friendly, and you don't have to worry about manually cleaning that. You can just pass in whatever relevant text into this urllib.parse.quote function. That is, you could think of that just as something that's taking a scrub brush to all of your values and prepping them for being placed into a URL. So if we scrub symbol clean, this doesn't actually do anything. This has no special characters in it, so that's fine. This function is not going to hurt anything if you pass in a value that doesn't need to be cleaned. It'll just come out unchanged. So we wanted to demo that. Then we're also going to define two different values here. I figure we can first download the PDF where we kind of mess up the date that we set. So the reason I want to do this is this was the source of the problem of what the person originally came to me with. She was having an issue where putting in the date as it existed in the workbook did not end up doing anything. So if we come out here, we can see this parameter is presented to us as this this month/day/year format with slashes between them. But if you look at how the workbook is actually storing that date, if we take a look at the cracking open this Tableau workbook file in a text editor, and we find the area where it's anywhere where this date cutoff parameter is used, you can see that the actual value that the workbook stores is in a year, month, day format. And instead of having slashes between it, it has hyphens or dashes. So this is the format that Tableau is actually storing under the hood. But if we go back to that workbook, we can see that doesn't match up with what we have here. In the actual version here, once again, year, month, day. Out in the workbook, it appears as month, day, year, with different characters separating the different date parts. All right, so that's going to put us in some trouble if we don't know that it's actually being stored differently in the workbook. And the reason we care about how it's being stored in the workbook is when we communicate with Tableau Server and we say, I want to actually set this parameter, this date parameter, to be a specific value. Well, we need to keep in mind how Tableau is actually interacting with that date so that we send in a value that makes sense. So if we send something in this format, the way it appears in the workbook, we're going to get actually no impact of passing that. Tableau is basically going to ignore it because it doesn't know what to do with it, because it's not speaking the same language Tableau is speaking, which is down here in this date format. Hopefully that's making sense. If not, feel free to leave some comments in the video, and we can maybe consider going into even more in-depth videos in the future. Just let me know. So anyways, we are defining two different versions of crypto symbols that we'll filter to, so we can see that filter is working in both scenarios that we're going to execute down below, but the date's only working when we follow that date format that Tableau is expecting on the back end. Okay, so let's make sure we run all these cells, and then every step along the way, once again, we're doing this urllib.parse.quote to clean these values. And as we get down here and we print out just what is stored in this date param name and date cutoff incorrect, we can see that everything for the most part just stays the way it was. We're not really using special characters here, so that urllib.parse.quote's not really doing anything, except over here where we have date cutoff. So this space gets replaced. That's not going to be a URL friendly character. So it disappears and is replaced by this %20. So that's what this urllib.parse.quote function is doing. I would say, unless you have some kind of compelling reason not to, if you're passing in these parameter values or these filter values in one of your queries, just always scrub those values or those names before passing them in. Just play it safe. Okay, so now we have that defined, and now we can define our paramdict, which is something that we can pass in as a optional parameter whenever we're using a lot of these tableau-api-lib methods. And this is going to correspond to over here, if you're using the query view PDF endpoint, out here we have the query view PDF method that we're calling on in the tableau-api-lib library, and that corresponds to the query view PDF endpoint that exists in the Tableau REST API. And over here, whenever we define a paramdict, that's basically saying, oh, there's extra stuff I want to pass in when I'm hitting this endpoint, and it defines all these things that would appear after this question mark. Same thing up here. All these guys are parameters. This is a URL parameter. And if we were to define things that we want for these kind of values out in our workbook or in our workflow, we could pass those in as part of this paramdict, and it would implement that for us. Okay, in this case, we're only filtering to this symbol filter that's going to be either Bitcoin or Ethereum. And then we have the date filter, and all these things we defined up above. So let's give this a go. And for starters, we're going to use that incorrect date format. So what we should expect to see is, even though we're saying, hey, I want this to be filtered to June 10th, 2021, we should end up seeing whatever's just the default in the workbook, which is July 29th, 2021. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this. And we get a response, and then we can output this file, and it should appear over here for me. And it appeared nice and quick. Let's take a quick look at the active endpoint so you can see how that URL parameter was built. We can see over here the views, which view we were querying, and then this /PDF, and then that question mark. And after that question mark, we should get all those different parameters that we defined up in our paramdict, just stitched together for us. So we have this VF underscore symbol that's defining Bitcoin as the thing, the crypto symbol that we're querying. So we should see Bitcoin USD in that PDF that we have over here. And then we have that date cutoff, and this is set to June 10th, 2021. But we expect this to be incorrect. So let's see. This should still be the July 29th, 2021 value. So if we open up this PDF, sure enough, we are getting Bitcoin, but we are not getting the correct date. So just to prove to you that the filter is working and it's just the date that's not working, let's go ahead and change this to crypto symbol FUSD. And let's download our PDF again, and then I'm going to output this as test view PDF2, so we get a different file. And if we look at this, we can see, okay, now I'm getting a different looking graph. So, oops, guess I can't just look at one then look at the other. But this is a slightly different pattern over here, and still the date is not being filtered down to that June 10th date that we want, but the filter for the crypto symbol is working correctly. All right, so let's fix how we are defining the date and then make sure that everything works as expected when we pass in the date format that Tableau is expecting. And let's just change this to date cutoff correct, redefine our paramdict, and come down here, query the view PDF once more, and then maybe name this test view PDF3. We get our results, and we can crack this open, and now we can see, all right, we are actually plugging in that cutoff date. It's getting communicated to Tableau. And so at the end of the day down here, we can see, okay, date cutoff now, it's just set to this year, month, day format, separated by these dashes or these hyphens, and that's exactly what Tableau is expecting. So everything works out. It's a nice happy ending, and that is how you can solve this tricky issue of How do you set a date in a parameter in a Tableau workbook when you're trying to download a view as a PDF or actually the crosstab data? So maybe we'll do another video as well where we show how this works with downloading the crosstab data, but it's really the exact same process. You would just use a different endpoint, whereas here we're querying a view PDF. You would just use the endpoint that queries the view data and then set up your parameters the exact same way we did them here. So hopefully that's going to help you out. I know it saved some time for someone who was really struggling with this. So I figure there's probably quite a few more people out there who have the same problem, and hope to see you again in future videos.